When people can read and study for themselves, they no longer become a slave to religion. Kenneth made a great statement on a video about how the church was able to hold people down by preventing them from being able to read the holy books to which they were believing is the word of this God. And by doing so, the Roman Catholic Church, as well as the Jewish temples, were able to dictate a person's perception of the world based on their inability to read the book to which this God so-called says that he is the God. I want you to think about something for a second. Galileo was threatened. Galileo was told that because he differed with the church cosmology, that the earth was not the center of the universe, that the earth was not the center of our solar system, that the earth revolved around the sun, that the earth wasn't flat. These types of things that Galileo was speaking of caused the church to persecute him because he was taken away from the church's cosmology and the church's understanding of how the world was, and that would cause people to not think that the church knew what it was talking about. You see, like Kenneth said, and his statement was incredibly long, so I couldn't put the whole thing on here, but he was saying that because people couldn't read the Bible themselves and only priests and monks were, people believed that the priest and monk were closer to God and had God's understanding, had God's anointing on them. So therefore, whatever they interpreted from the Bible was going to be the correct interpretation, because the people couldn't read Latin, so they couldn't read the Vulgate. They couldn't read Greek, so they weren't reading the Septuagint, not for themselves. And what happens when people are able to read for themselves? Well, they walk away with a different interpretation. They walk away with a different understanding. They realize that some of the things that the church was teaching them was not correct. This is why Tinsdale was persecuted. This is why they tried to persecute Martin Luther. They tried to persecute John Calvin. This is why the church had a problem with King James. Because by providing the Bible in English or in German, it provided the Bible in such a way that people, the average person, can read it for themselves. And we know what happens when people read things for themselves. They start to be independent of the organization. If you think about it, it is not until after the Renaissance that you start getting all these different denominations of churches. It is because of after the Renaissance, you get Calvinism, you get the Protestant Reformation, then you get the Anglican Church, and then you get the Episcopals, then you get the Methodists, and then you get the Baptists, and so on and so forth. And you continue and continue and continue and continue. And over the last four to 500 years, there are now like 30 to 40,000 different denominations of just Christianity alone. And this is because people were reading it for themselves and walked away with a different interpretation, because they weren't under the rule of the government and under the rule of church. And oftentimes, especially 500 years ago, church and government were the same thing. King James was the chief priest, the Pontiff Maximus of the Anglican Church, one and the same. It has always been said that if you allow a slave to read, they will no longer desire to be a slave. Julius Caesar wrote that when he caught one of his officers teaching a slave the trivium, which is critical thinking of gaining knowledge, the understanding of that knowledge, and then putting it into practice and gaining wisdom, that the slave would no longer desire to be a slave anymore. And he threatened his officer for teaching a slave how to read, how to write, and teaching him how to critically think. In American slavery, very few slaves were ever allowed to read, and only ones that they thought that they can control were allowed to read. But being able to read, being able to understand is what caused revolution. It what causes changes. So if you've been going to a church all your life, and you've never read the Bible, you've never studied it for yourself, you've never read anything outside of the Bible, you've never read the apologetic works, you've never read the secular anthropologists and archaeologists' work, anthropologists, yeah, I guess so, and you've never read the linguists' works, for those who may not agree with what your apologists are saying, then how do you know what you're really reading? How do you know what you're really studying? If you've never read the entire book of Leviticus, of Numbers, you never read Genesis from front to back, you've never read all of Paul's writings, you've never read all of Ephesians, you never read all of the of revelations? And how do you know what your pastors are telling you is the actual truth? How do you know they're not just making shit up? And then when they connect things and say, well, you know, one day in 2 Peter, one day unto God is like 1,000 years unto man. And then Adam and Eve, they died. He said they would die in that day, but yet they lived to be 900 plus years old. And so they can connect those two. But until you actually read the Old Testament and understand what a day is, what the word yom actually means, and please don't come with the Strong's Concordance, because that thing is so wrong. But when you start to realize that they're picking and choosing what they're putting together to make it sound like something that fits into the dichotomy of what you've been taught your whole life, if you've never studied it for yourself, then you'll always find yourself lacking. And this is where many people are, and this is why you're stuck in this church. This is why you don't grow. This is why you don't see the manifestations that you desire to see, because you're unwilling to go study it for yourself. So I implore you all, whether you're deconstructing or not, go study it for yourself and read it for yourself. It's been the biggest tool to keep you enslaved. And always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.